Long before anyone spoke of heaven or hell, the ancient Hebrews described a single destination for every person who died, not a place of fire or reward, but of dust, darkness, and silence beneath the earth. They called it Sheol. It appears roughly 65 times in the Hebrew Bible, yet most people have never encountered the word. What these ancient scriptures actually reveal about death may be nothing like what you expect. In the Hebrew scriptures, the term Sheol functions as the universal destination for those who pass away. Occurring 65 or 66 times within the ancient Masoretic text, this Hebrew word refers not to a final resting place of moral judgment, but to the collective home of the deceased. The early biblical authors envisioned this realm as a physical location situated far beneath the earth, a silent underworld where the conscious vitality of life simply fades. In this earliest stratum of biblical thought, there is no separation of souls based on earthly conduct. The righteous and the wicked share the same quiet fate. It is entirely distinct from later concepts of a fiery hell or a paradise of heavenly reward. Instead, the ancient Israelite writers viewed it as the natural, inevitable end of mortal existence. To descend into this subterranean space was the common lot of all humanity, marking the final boundary of earthly life in ancient Jewish cosmology. Ancient writers used stark, sensory language to convey the atmosphere of this underworld. The biblical poets described it as a place of absolute gloom and thick darkness, where the warmth of the sun never penetrates. Here, the physical reality of death is expressed through the imagery of dust, representing the human body returning to the soil from which it was formed. Silence and stillness define this existence. The writers compared death to a heavy, unbroken sleep, a state of complete inactivity where all conscious thought and action cease. Bodily decay is depicted through the presence of worms and maggots, marking the fading of physical strength. To seal this sense of finality, some passages describe the underworld as having massive gates and iron bars. It is a locked domain, a boundary from which no traveler can return to the land of the living. This poetic imagery grounds the abstract reality of mortality in a physical, tangible space beneath the ground, reminding the living of their own quiet end. The quiet inhabitants of this subterranean space are known in the biblical Hebrew texts as the Rephaim. This term, translating to shades or weakened ones, portrays the deceased as faint, powerless echoes of their former lives. They exist without the active, conscious properties of living souls. The word shares roots with the ancient Ugaritic arpum, a term linked to ancestral spirits in the wider Near Eastern world. In the Hebrew scriptures, these entities possess no supernatural agency or physical strength. Isaiah 26, verse 14, describes them as those who do not rise, while Psalm 88, verse 10, asks if these departed spirits can stand to offer praise. Within this cosmology, death represents a process of gradual dimming. The Rephaim do not experience ecstatic joy or active torment. Instead, they exist in a state of absolute passivity, surviving only as silent, listless shadows lingering in the dust. This subterranean existence strips away all earthly status, rendering Sheol the ultimate leveler of humanity. In the earliest biblical texts, the underworld does not sort the deceased into separate regions of reward and punishment. No divisions exist based on moral conduct, social standing, or piety. Instead, every individual, regardless of their earthly power or virtue, shares the exact same quiet fate. The book of Job describes this absolute equality in chapter 3, verses 17 through 19, noting that in death, the wicked cease from troubling, the weary are at rest, and the small and the great are there together, where the slave is free from his master. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 2 reinforces this absolute impartiality, stating that one fate comes to all, to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil alike. In this ancient cosmology, royal privilege, wealth, and poverty are completely dismantled. The mighty monarch and the lowly captive meet as absolute equals in the silent dust, sharing an identical, undifferentiated end that awaits every living soul. For the ancient Israelites, the ultimate sorrow of this subterranean existence was not physical torment, but spiritual isolation. In this underworld, the dead are cut off from the relationship with the living God. The biblical poets express this separation as a heavy, eternal silence that halts all worship. Psalm 115, verse 17 states directly that the dead do not praise the Lord, nor do any who go down into silence. Without breath, the departed can no longer participate in the community's songs of gratitude. This loss of connection forms the core of the psalmist's grief in Psalm 6, verse 5, which asks, "For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise?" To be in this silent state is to be forgotten and unable to offer thanks. The grief of death, then, is not the loss of physical life alone, but the permanent cessation of praise. While different traditions interpret these passages in various ways, the ancient text portrays the underworld as a place of absolute distance, where active relationship with God is entirely suspended. In the narrative accounts of the Hebrew Bible, this underworld transitions from a poetic metaphor into a physical, spatial reality defined by literal movement. The texts repeatedly employ verbs of descent to describe the transition from life to death. When the patriarch Jacob mourns his son Joseph in Genesis 37, verse 35, he declares that he will go down to Sheol in sorrow, framing death as a physical passage downward into the earth. This spatial dimension becomes terrifyingly concrete in the book of Numbers, chapter 16. During the rebellion of Korah, the earth splits open, swallowing the rebels and their households alive so that they go down directly into the depths. While descent is the norm, the narrative boundary between the living and the dead is occasionally breached from the opposite direction. In 1 Samuel chapter 28, King Saul seeks out the medium of Endor, who witnesses the spirit of the prophet Samuel coming up out of the earth. By describing the dead as rising up or being swallowed, these ancient accounts ground Sheol as a physical subterranean destination beneath the feet of the living. Around the 3rd century BCE, Jewish scholars in Alexandria began translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, creating the Septuagint. For the word Sheol, they chose the Greek term Hades. While Hades originally described the neutral Greek underworld of the dead, it carried its own cultural associations of mythology and eventual judgment. Centuries later, English translators faced a similar challenge, rendering Sheol and Hades as hell, grave, or pit. In the King James Version of 1611, the word hell appears 31 times for Sheol, projecting later ideas of a fiery place of torment onto an ancient, simpler Hebrew concept. This chain of translation functioned as active theological interpretation, forever altering how Western readers imagined the biblical afterlife. During the Second Temple period, Jewish theological thought began to expand past the ancient static concept of Sheol. The book of Daniel, reflecting the turbulent events of the 2nd century BCE, provides the earliest explicit biblical record of this transition. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, declares that many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. This passage introduces a future resurrection where individual moral choices yield different destinies. Rather than an undifferentiated underworld for everyone, later Jewish writers described active post-mortem judgment. Over time, the geographical valley of Hinnom became the symbolic concept of Gehenna, a destination of punishment, making the older subterranean realm part of a much wider, unfolding afterlife tradition. Today, Sheol remains a profound testament to how our deepest questions about mortality evolve over millennia. Understanding this ancient space invites us to read biblical texts on their own terms, free from later assumptions. How does this shade your own perspective? Join the conversation in the comments.